In this video, we're going to navigate through Isaiah 60 verses 1 to 7 with our Bible GPS. And we know the Bible GPS comprises of three major steps. The first one is the process of understanding. It helps us to get to the message to the original receiver. And if we get to the message to the original receiver, we ask the question, is that message still applicable to us? Because that question is necessary because we live in a completely different time, culture, and history. There's a huge gap between us and the people of the Bible. So therefore we ask the question, is that message still applicable to us in the 21st century? And that is the process of application. And then if it's applicable, we have the third process, the process of communication. So let us start with the process of understanding, and we use the acronym START, and that will take us to the message to the original receiver. And we know the S stands for the situation, and you can get many sources that will help you to get to the situation of Isaiah 60, but it's basically when the people returned from exile, they were facing poverty and destruction. It was a very, very sad situation they had faced there in Jerusalem. And we have a distinctive feature of Isaiah. He is reckoned as one of the most prominent prophets in the Old Testament. And then we go to the T of START, which is type of literature. Because we need to know what type of literature we are reading, because we cannot analyze a prophet like a narrative, because it's two different genres. So we know when it comes to the technique in languages, we have two techniques, poetry and prose. And each one of them has different themes. Like in poetry, you have the themes of wisdom, psalms, and prophecy. And we know Isaiah 60 is prophecy. And that will help us how to analyze this passage, because we know it's a prophecy. So the S and T of START helps us to approach the passage. And now we go to the A of START. This is where we spend most of our time. That is the analysis of the passage. And when you read a prophetic utterance or an oracle, we know it is poetry, because that was the way that the prophets conveyed their message to the people. It was poetry. So we got the poetry also in Psalms and the wisdom literature. We just do the same as what we have done with the Psalms and the wisdom in the step of analysis, the A of START. So when it comes to the analysis of the passage, I normally do 5 things. Number 1, I mark the parallelisms. Number 2, I find the meaning of difficult words and phrases, if any. Number 3, I mark the main elements. I zoom in, then I mark everything that relates, and then I zoom out to determine the meaning structure. That's number 4. I try to establish the meaning structure. And then number 5, then I try to conclude and summarize the message to the original receiver. So let us go through the process of analysis, or the A of START, and we do this with Isaiah 60 verses 1 through to 7. So when we read Isaiah 60 verses 1 to 7, I first look out for the parallelisms. So when we read Isaiah 60 verses 1 to 7, we see a few parallelisms there. So this is the first thing we do when we do the analysis of the passage. I'm looking for the parallelisms because it creates beauty. It shows there is a beautiful balance. It involves your emotion and it highlights the theme. So in verse 2, I have the first one there. For darkness shall cover the earth, and the thick darkness the peoples. So we see in the second line, and the thick darkness, it is the same as the first line for darkness. And then the peoples of line 2 is the same as the earth. So we see the second line repeats the meaning of the first line. Therefore, it's a synonymous parallelism. And then verse 2 continues with another parallelism. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will appear over you. So you see, will arise upon you is similar with will appear over you. But the Lord and his glory, it is also the same. So we see this is another example of a synonymous parallelism, where the second line repeats the meaning of the first line, just with different words. And then in verse 3, we have another parallelism. If we look at the second line and kings, it is parallel with nations. And if we go back to the second line, to the brightness of your dawn, is parallel with will come to your light. So this is another synonymous parallelism. Then we see another parallelism in verse 5, where the second line repeats the same meaning of the first line, just with different words. The second line, your heart shall thrill, is the same as then you shall see, and rejoice is the same as and be radiant. So this is also a synonymous parallelism. Then we have another one in verse 7. It says, all the flocks of Kedar is the same as the rams of Nebaioth, and then shall be gathered to you is the same as shall minister to you. So we see another synonymous parallelism. And as we read this passage, we are doing now the second thing. We see if we find difficult words and phrases. We see if there is any, and I don't really see any. So then we can go on to the next one, which is mark the main elements. So I read the passage, and then I see if I can find words that relate or meanings that will relate, just to see how the author had put down his thoughts. So when we go to verse 1, we see the first thing there is, arise, shine, for your light has come. So I see that the first thing that he's saying, to do something, arise, shine, and light, I mark it the same because it belongs together. Then you see in verse 2 is the same, will arise, will appear, I've marked the same. Also in verse 3, light, brightness, dawn. So you see all those words, they belong together. And then I read it over again. Then one thing that really struck me is all the future tenses. You see there in verse 2, shall cover, will arise, will appear. Verse 3, shall come. Verse 4, shall come, shall be carried. Verse 5, shall see, shall thrill, shall be brought, shall come. Verse 6, shall cover, shall come, shall bring, shall proclaim. Verse 7, shall be gathered, shall minister, shall be acceptable, will glorify. And I mark all of those the same. Then I realize, there are three different oracles. There is the one of a lawsuit, a woe, and a promise. And this will tell me this has to do with the promise because it's positive things. Will arise, will appear, shall come. So I mark all of that the same. So one can see these are the main elements. Verses 1, 2, and 3, it's all about the light, brightness, arise. And then the whole passage, it's all about the future tenses that I have marked. And then it takes me to number 4. Now I zoom out a little bit to establish the meaning structure. Do I see a meaning structure here? So when I read poetry in the Bible, I try to group verses together because there is normally a natural flow. So this is what I do. I just group the verses together. So when I look at the way I've marked this passage, I see that verses 1, 2, and 3, they contain words that relate, like shine, light, arise, etc. So then I will group those three verses together and I will summarize it. Light will come after darkness. You see, that is that promise. Light will come after darkness. And then I see verses 4 and 5, they belong together. And I summarize it as nations will come to their light. So in terms of the content, it's all about the nations that will come to their light. And then we see verses 6 and 7, it is all about material blessing. So it's actually a very positive passage to tell them there is a promise. Good things are coming. There will be a blessing. So light will come after darkness, verses 1, 2, and 3. Then nations will come to their light, 4 and 5, and they will experience material blessing, verses 6 and 7. And then number 5, I try now to conclude and summarize the message to the original receiver. And on page 183, I have summarized the message in my own words. Maybe you can summarize it in a different way. There's no right or wrong. So what I wrote there is the following. The passage wanted to teach the disillusioned exiles that returned to Jerusalem to look beyond the ruins of Jerusalem. They had to see that God remained committed to them and that future glory will come to Jerusalem. God sees beyond what they saw. God saw their destiny. Now, this is what I wrote is the message to the original receiver, because it's all about the future blessing that will come. They saw the ruins, but God looked beyond that. God saw a bright future. So this is what I do in the analysis. I zoom in and I zoom out. Then I got to the message to the original receiver, and that takes me now to the R of start, the relationship to the rest of the Bible. Does this message relate to the rest of the Bible? I have a few passages there for you, and I would like to read 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 8 to 9. Verse 8, we are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. So we see that this passage relates to the rest of the Bible, because you can go through difficult times, but you will not be crushed. You will still have the hope. So you can give a check mark. It relates to the rest of the Bible. So then we go to the T of start, the test of your findings, just to make sure that we are on the right track. This is where we read Bible commentaries or study Bibles, just to make sure that we are on the right track, because many other clever people have wrestled with this passage before us, and it's good to know what was their finding, and I promise you that we are actually on the right track. So you can give yourself a check mark, because it's indeed true that glory will come to Jerusalem. There will be a blessing again for Jerusalem, and that we need to look beyond the ruins or the difficulties of our lives to see that there is hope on the way. And then that brings us to the second process of the Bible GPS, and that is the process of application. Now, in the process of application, we determine if this message is incidental or essential. Incidental means it doesn't apply to us anymore, because our time is so different than the time of the people. Is it essential? Then we know it is applicable. And how do we determine whether it's incidental or essential? We need to look at the 3 laws as well as the 1 cultural practice. So if it's a civil law, we know it's incidental. But it's not a civil law. I don't see any building regulations or any bylaw in this passage. So it's not a civil law. Is it ceremonial law? Well, I don't see any ceremonial law in this passage where they need to bring a sacrifice. Is it a cultural practice where they need to do something that pertains to their culture? I don't see anything like that. Is it a moral law? And if it is a moral law, then we know it is an essential. It is indeed a moral law, because it's a universal guideline telling us how to live. That we need to realize that there is always hope for us, that we need to look beyond the difficulties of our life. So it's a moral law, so we can give it a check mark. It is applicable in the 21st century. Therefore, in the third process of communication, we can find creative ways how to communicate this message. You know, a minister or a pastor will write a sermon. You can use drama, PowerPoint, many other ways how to convey this message in the 21st century. You can have group discussions as well. I would like to read you the 2 quotes I have there that you can maybe discuss in your small group. The first quote is by St. Augustine. He says the following: faith is to believe what we do not see, and the reward of this faith is to see what we believe. I just love this quote. And then C.S. Lewis said the following: I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Those are 2 great quotes that you can discuss in your small group. I trust that this video about Isaiah 60 verses 1 to 7 and how we have applied the GPS method, that it will help you to read the other prophets, and that you will be inspired to know that the prophets, although not always easy to understand, the principles are still applicable to us in the 21st century. Thank you.